I like bow ties. I work on Linkerd, which is an open source service mesh, which Carol will tell you about later. And before this, I worked at Twitter. Okay, so things I'm going to cover in the next 15 to 20 minutes. What is GraphQL even? How do we make queries with GraphQL? How to add GraphQL to an app if you have an existing app? How to use it to like connect different types of data, and how to go about choosing a GraphQL library or an open source library in general. Okay, so what is GraphQL? It's a specification for what? For API query language and a server runtime that executes the queries. And it also includes a type system so that you can like make type queries and be assured of the type of data you're getting back. So it's not tied to any specific database or implementation on the back end. Like you can use whatever you want or whatever you're currently using. So if you're querying like a key value store or like MySQL or Prometheus or whatever it is, like you can still get data from that and then return it with GraphQL. This is like very abstract, so let's just go look at an actual GraphQL query. So this is like a little editor that lets me make queries against my GraphQL server. So how I make a query in GraphQL is I define this like, so there's a root query field and just call it query. We'll talk about it later. But then I just type the query that I want. So a simple example is this like hello world example where I query hello and I get back some string data. But a more traditional API would be like this kind of thing where, you know, typically you have /API/users and you get a bunch of users from your database. So you can see the different fields here. And how I would do like this type of query in GraphQL would be, I would type query users. But the thing with GraphQL is that you need to specify what data you want, and it will return only that data. So like you can see here, like I have all the list of users from my database, but I have all the possible fields. But let's say I only want name, then I would just specify name, and it will give me back a list of users and only their name. And you can do this like in your regular API implementation by just having an endpoint that only returns name. But what if you wanted to do like some combinations? You wanted to say name and public ID, then you could just type that in the query here and get it back. And notice that the data you get back is the same shape as the data you put in. And like that's like a little bit more complicated to do if you were doing it in traditional sense, but you could do it with like query parameters. Yeah, so that's a little bit about querying. And another thing I want to say about querying is you can use you can make different queries in the same request. So like under this big query type here, you can specify the hello query as well as the user's query. And then that'll give you back the data for hello and users, and you've only made one call to your backend. So like typically you would make a call to the hello endpoint and then the user's endpoint, but here I'm just saying, like, just give me hello and users, and I save myself some trips. Nope, that's not it. This is it. And another cool thing is that there's this like playground that you can use to test out your queries and also to explore your data graph, and we'll go have fun with it very soon. Okay, so we decided that we like GraphQL from this minute of demo, and we want to go add it to our app. How do we do that? Well, first we like go to the GraphQL website, we pick a server library in whatever language we want. There's about 5 in Go. We are going to define a schema which will say, okay, these are the types of queries I want to make in my backend, and then for each type of query, we'll define a function that will say how to get the data for that query. So everything in GraphQL is like a type and a field. So for example, users is like a type, an array of users, and a user has fields on it. And the fields are like data attributes of that object. So when you're implementing this, you're going to have to like say, okay, for a user, I want to get back a name, an ID, and their favorite emoji, and then you'll have to go and define a function that will tell GraphQL how to get the data for those fields. So, and also, I made a demo app that shows you like step-by-step how to add GraphQL for like a very simple hello world, and then we'll go through like how to add a user's database and query for users, and then also like gRPC service and how to get data from users and the gRPC service at the same time and stitch them together. So there's like a step-by-step kind of tutorial-like thing, and I'll give you all the links at the end, but it'll be slower than what I'm about to say now. So we want to implement the hello world query. What we do is like we define a schema and it has fields, and the root field is always query. I mean, there's like query and mutation and subscription, which I'll talk about later. But on this query type, we have one field, which is hello, which is like the field we want to query, and that returns a string. Okay, so for every field, we need to define a function that will tell it how to get the data for that field. And so here we define the hello function, returns a string, and I'm just returning like plain old constant string. However, if I wanted to implement like users, then I would say, okay, users is an array of user, and I would probably make a database call here, and then I would return all the user objects. Okay, so a cool thing we can do is connecting different data types. So again, like we're going back to like we have users, and let's say we have this other endpoint that's like emoji that lists emoji shortcodes and Unicode. So you see here, like every user in our database has a favorite emoji, but it's stored as a shortcode. Well, what if we wanted to instead go to this API and we want to get the Unicode equivalent and return it in place of this favorite emoji shortcode string? Well, what that would look like in here is if I want to like get the list of users, I want to get their names, I also want to get their favorite emoji, and I'll specify, so I've already wired this up to call the emoji service, but I can specify that I want the Unicode equivalent, and then it'll give me back this pretty emoji instead of giving me back the shortcode, which I could also query. But like what and how does it do that? Well, let's go back here. The like important thing is that favorite emoji is a field on user, and we're defining a function here that will satisfy that field. And how it does that is it takes the favorite emoji shortcode from the database, it calls a different gRPC service, and then puts the data back into a different resolver, well, an emoji resolver, so that you can look up the fields of emoji, and it returns it. And that allows us to do this cool thing where we specify what data we want field by field, and it just gives it back. Okay. There's a lot of other things that GraphQL does that are really cool, but I can't tell you about them because we need to leave at some point. These include parameterized queries. So like you know, in regular old REST, you can do get /user/1. You can do the same thing in GraphQL, although it's really cool because you can specify like the types of your arguments. So you can say, like I can have like a get users with a string name or a int ID, and that looks something like users ID1, and you'll get back that user. Well, if you have implemented your resolvers for that query. You can also like do things like creating and updating, and you do those via mutations that allow you to change existing data. You have subscriptions, which are cool because subscriptions are like the server is looking at the data, and if the data changes, it'll send a notification back to the client. So like you might want to do that if you're having an email app or something, and you're like, oh, okay, I got a new email, like let the client know, so you can display a red dot. Introspection. So it's really cool, but because you've defined the entire schema for your GraphQL server up front, you can go explore it. And this is cool because you have all your documentation and like a list of all the queries in one place. Like if you just told me your API was available at /API and I went there, I mean, I could guess API users, I could guess API emoji, but you might have like 10 different objects that you can query here, and I'll never know about it unless like I read your API docs. But with GraphQL, I can like go into this root query type. Let me just get rid of this because it's distracting. Okay, there we go. So I can go into the root query type and see the different fields that I can query. And you see I've defined a hello query, I've defined users query, an emojis query, and also this parameterized query that I was talking about, which is I can pass in a short code as a string and I can get back an emoji. So like I would never have figured out, well, I mean, if you're adhering to REST, yes, I can figure out /emoji/1, but like if I was like, I don't know, /starships, I wouldn't know that it was in here. Yeah, so that's a little bit about introspection. And also, you'll notice that there's some documentation in here. You can see that an emoji is an emoji from the gRPC service. And how you get that in there is actually just, oh, here we go. You can just write comments in your schema. So this is the schema I've defined, which is like a little bit more complicated example than I've shown you in the slide, but you can see the 4 queries we defined. We have like our documentation here as comments, and the resolvers that tell us how to get the data. Okay, choosing a GraphQL library. Recently, I had to choose a GraphQL library. I looked in our Git history, and indeed, a year before, SB had implemented a GraphQL endpoint. So I looked at SB's code, and the library SB used was not available anymore under that name, but it just moved somewhere else. So I went, I mean, there's like 5. There's more than 5, but you can go to the GraphQL website and we'll list like for every language what libraries are available. So I went there. There were a lot for Go, way more than other languages. So I looked on Medium for a blog to point me in the right direction, as you do. And it still like wasn't conclusive. You're just like, oh, this is good for this is good for that, but it was very abstract. So what I did was I just picked a simple query to implement, and I implemented it in multiple libraries. And then I saw, like, once you do that, you kind of get a feel for what it's like working in each library. And one of them was very ugly and hard to read. And if you had to add a new query type, it was not as simple as just writing it in that nice text form query schema. So I looked at that. I also looked at like the commit velocity of each repo, because open source, and I was like, oh, maybe one is abandoned and it will make my decision easier. They were both like equally kind of active. So next I looked at open issues and resolved issues and bugs to see if any of them, were terrible. None of them were terrible, but I did find that working in one of them was a lot easier to understand than working in the other one, so I picked that one. This is the best advice I can give you. If anyone has good advice, please let me know. Okay, so to recap, pros: getting exactly the data you want, which is good because you don't have like a massive payload of, like, if you just want a list of usernames, you're not like grabbing all the data you can from the server. You can get multiple queries by making a single request, so it saves you a bunch of round-trip times. You can explore the API and have good documentation, which is very nice. It's really good for prototyping. So if you don't know what you want or you don't know what you want to offer, it's really easy to just add and subtract a bunch of fields, and it's really easy to like mash together all your data types, which is just convenient. And then like if you settle on something, then you can implement it in non-GraphQL if you wanted to for caching purposes, which brings me to the next slide, things to look out for. Everything has, as Kelly Clarkson says, everyone has a dark side. So, yeah, and here it is like in typical REST, you know, you can have cache like your typical HTTP caching, which is everyone has done before. But with GraphQL, you're only hitting one endpoint, which is /GraphQL, and typically you just send it a request with the body being the query that you want. And so it's more difficult to cache that. There are some libraries, mostly JavaScript ones, that do help you with the caching, but this is like something to look out for. Another thing is query depth. So imagine your user's object had a field called friend, which is a user. Then you could do user.friend.friend.friend.friend.friend, and you can just keep going down that chain into like an arbitrary query depth if you don't watch out, which can cause you to DDoS your own servers. You can also request a bunch of data like very easily. So it's easy for me to say, oh, get all the users in my database, and for each user, get their favorite emoji, but get it as not as a Unicode, and then I'm making like, if I have 100 users in my database, then I've made 100 calls to my emoji service to satisfy that resolution, which, again, like knowing your query patterns is helpful. Other thing is that there is a learning curve. At first, I was very intimidated and none of it made sense, but then implementing simple examples and going from there was really helpful for me. So I hope that the small talk has inspired you to learn about GraphQL, and then the rest is history. Oh, I thank you. They laughed. Yeah, so all the resources and a bunch of links and a repo with a more step-by-step tutorial is available at this link, or you can stalk my GitHub and find it. Thanks. Also, if you have questions, go.
Well, which library did you end up choosing?
Oh, I chose Graph Gophers, which was originally Neelance. And the other one that I was deciding between was like this one and yeah, I'm just gonna go over here. I had looked at this Medium post, and the ones I was considering were these 5, and I basically implemented the first 2, and I liked the Graph Gophers one way better. Yeah.
Nice. Oh, that's so funny. It's one in like Facebook.
Oh, nice.
Yeah. That's kind of like the bread and butter of his career, I think. Too.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah.
Whoa.
Yeah. Sorry, I actually had a real question. Not just a dumb comment like that. And maybe this is more like I don't know. Okay, so it's faster. Okay, using something like GraphQL is like, it has advantages because it's faster, because if you need to call separate endpoints for one perfect blob that you're trying to build, basically,
yeah,
perfect JSON blob. It's faster for that reason because you are only calling the GraphQL. But does that mean? Okay, this is a very elementary question, but so that means like GraphQL, whatever how it's set up is, it can do that quickly because is it like a multi-threaded thing or like a?
It's kind of because you can control it. Like it's because you as a client aren't making 10 requests to separate endpoints yourself and stitching them together. It's just more like so originally this was created by Facebook for like mobile users. Mm-hmm. So what they wanted to do was reduce the amount of data sent between mobile and their servers. Okay. So I think it was more like preventing them from making calls to 5 endpoints, and instead they just made a call to 1 endpoint and got the data back. And so that was the reduction. It's definitely like, if you're making the calls on the server side instead, it still takes time to get those, but I think that you would have more control over like the environment that like your servers are talking to your other backend servers than like between your server and whatever clients that might be external.
Okay.
You in the back.
So does Facebook use GraphQL in production?
Yes. So does GitHub.
So does GitHub. Yeah, I was going to ask, do you know other places that use it in production?
Yeah.
Because it seems like it's awesome, but then also there did seem to be some dangers of the open queries.
Yeah. So these people use GraphQL in production, and it was like pioneered at Facebook, and I'm pretty sure they still use it. And they have like really good JavaScript libraries that they do this in.
Are you using a JavaScript? Sorry.
Yes.
Are you using a JavaScript library, or are you?
I'm not,
okay.
but I have like used one, and it was nice. I liked it. Any more questions? If you have, also, you can go here and you'll have all the links, and the repo that you can play with is here. There's a lot of explanations, but there's also a step-by-step set of things that will let you, have very bite-sized PRs so you can look at like how to do this exact thing, and maybe it won't be intimidating. Yeah. Any more questions? Okay, great.
Cool. So I'm going to set up for my